Hey everybody, this is Chris Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week, I'm happy to welcome back for, I think, his fourth appearance on the show, Dr. Chris Masterjohn. Dr. Masterjohn earned his PhD in nutritional sciences from the University of Connecticut in the summer of 2012. He served as a postdoctoral research candidate in comparative biosciences at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And he was also an assistant professor of health and nutrition sciences at Brooklyn College, which is part of the City University of New York. He's currently conducting independent research, consulting, and collaborating on information and technology products related to nutrition, and also producing his own content to help people gain better health. I've known Chris for many, many years. He was one of the first nutritional sciences and researchers that I came across in my career. And I've always been inspired by his attention to detail, his very, very deep dives into the scientific literature, and his encyclopedic understanding of nutritional science. He is my go-to person when I have any questions about nutrient interactions or nutrient effects on biochemistry. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with his work, but I'm really excited to talk to him today about the importance of nutrient density and how nutrient deficiencies can occur even in the context of a healthy nutrient-dense diet. All right, let's dive in. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. I hope this podcast and my blog and books have been helpful resources for you and will continue to be. But if you've been struggling with a chronic health problem and are feeling stuck, consider coming to work with my team and me at the California Center for Functional Medicine. We work with patients all over the U.S. and have experience treating a wide range of conditions, including GI problems, autoimmunity, hypothyroidism, cognitive mood and behavioral issues, weight gain and metabolic dysfunction, and more. Our unique model teams clinicians with nurse practitioners and health coaches, all of whom are trained in my ADAPT framework approach to provide a high level of care to our patients. This means more support between appointments, personalized guidance on diet, lifestyle, and behavior change, a cutting-edge patient portal with 24/7 access to your labs and records, handouts and resources to guide your protocols, and a team of practitioners working together on your case. We're currently accepting new patients, so if you'd like to learn more, visit chriskresser.com/become-a-patient. Okay, now on to the show. Chris, such a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's great to be here.
One of my earliest guests. I think this is number 3 or 4 appearances,
This would be number 4. Yeah.
Number 4. Awesome. So we're going to talk about something a little bit different today, but obviously well within your wheelhouse, and I'm really excited to discuss it. Last week, I was asked to give a talk at the UCSF Osher Mini Medical School, and they wanted me to talk about supplements. But I told them that in order to talk about supplements, I needed to spend the first 90% of the talk discussing important concepts like nutrient density, why it's important to get nutrients from food whenever possible, and what the nutrients are that we should be thinking the most about. And it occurred to me that even though I've talked about nutrition for years, we've never really had that specific discussion in depth on my podcast. And when I thought of somebody that I wanted to have that discussion with, you were the most obvious choice, because this is something you spent years and countless hours of study, both personally and then professionally over the past decade. So I'd love to dive into to do a really deep dive here on nutrition, meeting nutrient needs from food, the concept of nutrient density, and then more specifically, how the average person can figure this all out, because it can be really confusing, and they're not going to get the answers they need if they go into their doctor in most cases.
Absolutely.
So,
sounds great.
Let's start with, somebody might be listening to this and thinking, well, why, I eat a nutrient dense paleo type of diet, or, Weston Price style diet. Why should I be concerned? I'm eating all the right foods. I'm meeting my needs for nutrients. So do I even really need to pay attention to this?
Yeah, well, I think, that's kind of the point of eating that way, is that you want to do whatever can bring you closest to not having to care about it in as simple a way that you can integrate into your life as possible. So we eat that way in large part because that way of eating is the way that focuses on the right mix of nutrient-dense foods that should make sure all our nutrients are there. The thing is, you have to consider two things. One is, just from a theoretical standpoint, is that actually guaranteeing you that you're meeting all your nutritional needs? And then also, what is your experience like? Because if you're coming to this eating this way and having zero problems in your life, no problems with your skin, you're incredibly youthful, you're incredibly energetic, everything's going right, well, that's one thing. But if you're coming from this and you are always a little bit more tired than you think you should be, or your skin's a little bit flakier than it should be, or you're getting wrinkles a little bit earlier than you thought you would, or God forbid, something even greater, like you had a heart attack and you're only 47, then of course you should care, because there are things that you have not fixed yet, no matter what that theoretical framework is. So if we go back to the first part of that, the theoretical framework, first of all, we are trying to do what is ancestral, but we are doing that from A, imperfect knowledge of what is ancestral, and B, imperfect resources. So to take something, a really simple concept, like our ancestors ate nose to tail. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, in the modern incarnation, it means I try to eat liver once a week and I try to make some soups out of bones. And so I'm using the whole animal, right? Well, actually, you just used a couple pieces of that animal that we didn't. Our ancestors, either because they knew it was important or economic necessity or both, utilized most of the animal that they could. And so they got a totally different balance of nutrients by incorporating the different organ meats. But facts be told, we don't really know exactly how often they ate liver. We don't know everything about, did they eat the liver of this animal versus that animal and in what mix. Like, there's a lot of things where we're relying on what people have passed down to us from studying certain groups for a couple of months and trying to understand what they understood. But there's just a lot that we don't know. Then you get actually into the kitchen and the question is, are you really eating nose to tail? Like, did you actually eat the heart also? Did you eat the kidneys? Like, there's a lot of different nutrient profiles in those organs, and none of us are really eating nose to tail. We're just trying to incorporate what is easy and simple out of the nose to tail concept. If you look at an animal carcass, about half of it is probably collagen. Are you really getting that much, like half your protein from collagen because you're making gravies and soups out of bones? Probably not. Like, you can eat bones. You're getting way more of the collagen proteins, way more of the minerals. Like the Inuit, for example, they would take fish bones and freeze dry and pulverize them. They didn't soak them and get whatever leached into the water. They ate the bones, right?
Right.
So there are many traditions that we're only imperfectly carrying out, and that's one part of that framework. Then there
are other issues like for produce, right, where we're now eating domesticated, genetically modified, not in the sense of scientifically or with modern technology genetically modified, although there is that too, but just engineered by humans over many generations to be sweeter and have a different flavor profile, and they're far less nutrient dense than their wild ancestors, right? So,
well, absolutely, and not only that, but on top of that, just transportation of food causes a huge nutrient loss and loss of flavor profile. I mean, this is a major problem for the food industry that they're trying to solve, that whatever breeding they've done to make the foods have a sweeter flavor or enrich this or that, the fact is that they can't harvest fruits, including some culinary vegetables like tomatoes. Like, they can't harvest these foods when they're fully ripe because they will be bad by the time people buy them. So they're actually harvested at a time that is not ideal for the flavor profile or the nutrient density. So like, you can eat all those same foods, but because of the soil or because of the transportation or because when it's harvested, you're losing out on a lot of those nutrients. And we only have a partial grasp on to what extent is that for all the different foods. And then the other leg of that is, who are you, right? If if we're trying to eat ancestrally, we're drawing from all these different ancestral groups. But some of our ancestors, some hunter-gatherers that weren't our direct ancestors personally, all these different groups were in specific environments that caused them to evolve genetically in ways that changed the nutrients that they need, right? So there is, if you look at the Inuit, for example, they have genetic adaptations and cultural adaptations to the Arctic environment. They have different needs for vitamin D and calcium than most people with ancestry from Europe do, for example. And you can then say, well, you could try to think about it like, well, I'm just going to eat like my European ancestors did. But first of all, do you really have like a monolithic ancestry to one part of Europe? Probably not. Probably, I mean, I know I certainly am mixed, and most of us are pretty mixed. But then even still, it's always the case that within each of those groups, there's a lot of variation between individuals, right? So that group adapted to that environment to best support those people on the whole, but it's still the case that different individuals in any population are going to have varying nutritional needs. And so who are you as a person and what are your nutritional needs? That we can only begin to test with the genetic testing that's available to us. For the large part, it's only going to be our cumulative experience that is going to allow us to fine tune our diet to our own needs.
So this is so important for people to understand. And there are so many other factors too that we haven't even really touched on yet. One of them that I mentioned in my talk was just the increase in the incidence of health conditions that impair nutrient absorption and assimilation. And, SIBO would be a great example of that. I constantly see patients in my clinic who are following a paleo or other kind of nutrient-dense diet, and yet they're still deficient in nutrients. They have SIBO. We treat their SIBO without changing their diet or giving them any supplements, and those nutrient levels return to normal. And so that's just one example, but there are so many other examples of conditions that impair nutrient absorption. And then we have things like changes to the microbiome. We know that our gut bacteria play a large role in nutrient absorption and assimilation as well. So it's really kind of mind-boggling when you start to consider all the factors in the modern lifestyle that affect this.
Definitely. Even outside the gut, chronic inflammation, as one example, increases the degradation and the need for vitamin B6.
Right.
And so it doesn't matter if that inflammation is coming from the gut or from something else. That's going to impact your nutritional needs. Even after you're absorbing the B6, that's relevant.
And obesity and inflammation decrease the conversion of sunlight to vitamin D and decrease the absorption of vitamin D. And then we have environmental toxins like heavy metals that interfere with nutrient absorption and assimilation. So,
and nutritional impacts on being able to deal with those heavy metals too. Like arsenic, for example, is primarily detoxified through methylation. So arsenic sapping your methyl groups, but if you don't have enough methyl groups, that arsenic is accumulating and poisoning other metabolic pathways too. So it's a two-way street, or more than two-way street, more often than not.
Right. So I can hear some people, listeners, throwing up their hands and saying, F it, we're done this. I'm not going to pay any attention to this anymore. I thought I was doing all the right things and it was going to save me. Don't do that. It is true that we have a lot of challenges, but we're going to talk about an incredible document that Chris has put together, a nutrient cheat sheet that I've been using in my practice. All the clinicians have been, and is really super helpful for helping you get your head around this in a number of ways. And we'll come back to that later. So there is a path forward. Don't despair. But it is important to realize that just eating a good diet isn't necessarily enough to insulate you from all of the considerable challenges that we face in this modern world that we live in. So, with that context, Chris, maybe let's move into some of the primary nutrients of concern. And we hear a lot all the time about, of course, the basic vitamins and minerals, but then a whole bunch of other, phytonutrients, antioxidants. And when I did the talk at UCSF, there was so much confusion about what, there are people who are taking all kinds of different supplements, from things you've never even heard of, that they read about on the internet, to, of course, the more basic vitamins and minerals. So where, if someone is wanting to take the next step and focus their efforts, where do they start? Do we start with the basics, or do they move, think about these more exotic kind of substances, which are very popular right now?
Well, I think that however you start, you want to be comprehensive in some way, right? So if you wanted to be truly comprehensive, then you would do a comprehensive lab screening, you would do a comprehensive dietary and lifestyle analysis, you would do a comprehensive sign and symptom checklist. But, what you have what kind of resources you have at your disposal really has to dictate what actually makes sense for you, right? So at this point in our juncture, and I'm sure you have more experience than I do with this, but it's my impression that the average person is not going to be able to run all of the best tests without paying out of pocket for most of it.
That's correct.
And if they are paying out of pocket for most of it, the average person for whom it is important to understand this stuff cannot afford to do comprehensive lab testing, paying out of pocket initially.
Also correct. Yeah.
And so I do know some people for whom that is the best initial approach, but that's not the average person. So for most people, the resources that they have, I think all of us feel strapped for time, but that's a matter of priorities, right? Like all of us could say, I'm going to reprioritize what I'm doing this week, and I'm going to put the effort into cataloging the food that I eat and see where it matches up in a nutritional database. And I think that can be one of the most helpful places for people to start with this. And if you're doing something like that, the way that maybe you have other tools that you use, what I would be doing is I'd use Chronometer, which is a smartphone app where you can plug in all the foods that you're eating, and it'll tell you how you're matching up to the recommended daily values. And, that doesn't tell you everything because your needs might be higher or lower than the recommended daily values. And also the food that you're eating may be higher or lower in nutrients than whatever's in the nutritional database. But it gives you a starting place to assess probability, because if you don't have, you may discover from that, wow, my dietary selection is leading me to get 10% of the RDA for vitamin B1 and everything else looks good. That suddenly that's a major clue that can point you in the right direction. But then the other thing that you can do is catalog your signs and symptoms. And, anyone can go plug their food into a nutritional database. The signs and symptoms is a little bit harder. That's where I think one of the places where the cheat sheet that I produced comes into value, because I've cataloged together in alphabetical order all the things that you could look through and then trace it back to those nutrients and their probabilities. But if you can do that, then you can say, well, my signs and symptoms match up to vitamin B1 deficiency. So does my diet. Suddenly you've put maybe a few hours of time into this, and you've gotten on a lead that has led you to this one particular nutrient, which no one else was talking about. A lot of people are talking about vitamin D, and that may well be your top problem, but you don't want to be at the mercy of what everyone is talking about. You don't even want to be at the mercy on whatever the highest probability nutrient deficiency is, right? Because you're not a probability, you're a person, right? So it doesn't really, I think it's useful to say, like, well, in my consulting, I see zinc deficiency coming up as much more common than these other things. And it makes sense to have that discussion. But at the end of the day, for you as an individual, it's much more valuable to look at your own diet, lifestyle, and signs and symptoms to see what's most probable for you.
I agree 100%. And having said that, I think it is useful to talk a little bit about nutrient intake and even the concept of RDA, because that's somewhat problematic. So in my UCSF talk, I had a slide, and this was data from the NHANES study. It was reproduced from a table on the Environmental Working Group website, which they got from the NHANES study. And it has the percentage of dietary intake below the RDA broken down by nutrient, by population, 2 to 8-year-old kids, 14 to 8-year-old, teenagers, and then adults 19 and older. And some people people in the audience were pretty shocked to see some of these numbers, but 95% of adults don't get enough vitamin D, 94% don't get enough vitamin E, 61% don't get enough magnesium, 51% don't get enough vitamin A, 49% don't get enough calcium, 43% don't get enough vitamin C, and so on. Those are the major ones. And as you pointed out,
98% don't get enough potassium.
Right. So, this is a partial list, and there are others, as you pointed out, that aren't on this list. But suffice to say that a majority of Americans, and sometimes almost everybody, are not getting enough key nutrients and minerals. And that's enough as defined by the RDA. So let's talk a little bit about the RDA and what some of the problems with the RDA are. Because if they're not even getting enough RDA and the RDA is not sufficient, what does that mean?
Well, I don't think the RDA in and of itself is problematic conceptually. And I think that there's a misperception in a lot of the alternative health community that the RDAs are established just to prevent the classical diseases of nutrient deficiencies that no one gets anymore. And that's not true at all. The RDAs, originally when all we knew about was that's what they were set based on. But now what they try to do is a comprehensive review of all of the science and figure out what is the best measure for optimal health. Now, that's always going to be imperfect because, number one, there's a lot of disagreement on how to approach that. Like 10 experts can look at a study and come to the same study and come to different conclusions. There's there are philosophical differences on should you err on the side of getting a little bit more than you need versus a little bit less than you need if you're trying to be optimal. And then there's just the fact that the science evolves. Almost all of the RDAs that are currently published are years old. Even the vitamin D and calcium ones, which are fairly recent, are like 8 years old now. So there's evolving research that has not been incorporated into a lot of the RDAs. Some of them that we currently have are from the 1990s, and we could certainly say a lot about what studies have come out since then about maybe needing more than that value. Although even the RDA is it's not based on the principle that everyone needs to get the RDA. It's based on the principle that we assume there's variation in nutritional needs, and the RDA is meant to capture 97.5% of those people. Mm-hmm. So even by its own admission, conceptually, meeting the RDA for 2.5% of people will mean that they're not getting enough, even according to the RDA. Right. But there's also people who just don't need the RDA because they're lower. But what you find is that in most of the RDAs, when they set them, they say there's not enough evidence to say what the variation in needs are. So we're just going to assume it's 20% or something like that. And so there's not really any evidence-based way to capture what that variation is. Mm-hmm. So, at the end of the day, also this philosophical idea of, do you want to set your goal to get just enough? Right. If you look at the research of Weston Price in his epic work, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, one of the points that he made was that our ancestral diets were generally full of 4 times as much nutrients,
way above the RDA
minimum. Yeah. Because what you don't want is to meet your bare minimum needs and then get pregnant, right? Or then get injured, right? Or then get sick, right?
No buffer.
Then all of a sudden, your reserves have no extra, and now your needs are twice as much, and now your diet has half of what you need. Yeah. Right. So I think that's where the big divergence is between the ancestral approach and the RDA, is that the RDA is trying to capture those minimal needs, and our ancestors were trying to eat as nutrient dense and abundance as they could to cover all of those contingencies.
That's a great point. I want to extend that a little bit and mention another one too. If the RDA is what's required to avoid acute deficiency syndromes, that also doesn't tell us what amount of that nutrient is required to avoid chronic problems for one thing, much less what amount is required for optimal health, which is perhaps a different question altogether. And that's what you were hinting at just now, I think. The other issue is that we haven't touched on yet is bioavailability of a particular nutrient. So if you look at just a sheet of paper, a list of nutrients, the foods that contain certain nutrients. Let's talk about calcium just as an example of this. So if you look at a list of calcium in foods, you'll see that foods like collard greens and spinach are pretty high on the list. So collard greens, about a cup of collard greens has 268 milligrams of calcium. Spinach has 245. And those are listed above foods like bone-in sockeye salmon with 188 milligrams of calcium. So somebody might justifiably look at that list and say, oh, I'm eating plenty of dark leafy greens, so I must be meeting my calcium needs. What's the problem with that assumption?
Yeah, well, the problem is those vegetables. So most plants accumulate oxalate as a way of preventing calcium concentrations from getting too high. It's sort of like if your calcium level in your blood goes too high, you have hypercalcemia, and in humans, we want most of our calcium in our bones and teeth so that we can let it out into the blood when we need more and we can store it when we need less. Well, plants, they don't have blood, but they have that same need to regulate their calcium levels. And so kind of like we store calcium in our bones, they store it mostly as calcium oxalate. But the oxalate levels in different plants are very different. And what you find is that in general, plants that have higher oxalate levels have much lower calcium bioavailability because that calcium oxalate just sits in your intestines until you poop it out. And spinach is a great example of that. The bioavailability of calcium from spinach is only 5% versus 50 or 60% for most cruciferous vegetables. And I don't know what it is for the bone-in sockeye salmon, but in general, from bone and from milk, you're going to be absorbing a good 30 or 40% of that calcium. So, but the thing is, they did a study once where they fed people calcium oxalate pills, and they had higher calcium bioavailability than the calcium from spinach. So it's not just oxalate. There's a pattern of things that are dictating how absorbable that calcium is, and we don't actually know what they all are. We just know that we've done various studies feeding people foods and tracing how much of that calcium gets into their body. And we know with specific foods that in generally the cruciferous vegetables have pretty good calcium bioavailability. Generally, most other plants don't. So from like beans, for example, you're probably absorbing maybe 20% of the calcium. From rhubarb, you're absorbing 9%. From spinach, 5%. I'm not sure what collard greens is, but it's probably pretty low. But even cruciferous vegetables, like you'd have to eat 4.5 servings of broccoli to get 1 serving of milk's worth of calcium. And that's defining a serving as a half a cup cooked. But if you're trying to get 3 glasses of milk worth of calcium, that's got to be
16
6 or 7. Well, it's 4.5 half cup servings. So it's like 2.25 cups of broccoli equals 1 glass of milk. So you're looking at 7 cups more or less of cooked broccoli. That's a lot.
Good luck with that.
Right.
And I think I read somewhere it's like 16 cups of raw spinach, and
it would be. I mean,
8 cups of
it's ridiculous to even talk about getting it from spinach. The bioavailability is so low. Like if the bioavailability from spinach is 5%, I mean, first of all, if you eat that much spinach, you're probably impairing your calcium absorption from your other foods. So you'd probably be better off just not eating the spinach.
And you might end up with like calcium oxalate kidney stone.
Yeah, right. What happens to you when you eat 16 cups of spinach? What happened to Papa?
Yeah, and there's so many other examples of this, right? There's the zinc in animal products is much more bioavailable than zinc in plant foods. We know that heme iron is significantly more, which is the form found in animal products, is significantly more bioavailable than, ferrous forms of iron in plants. And you and I have both written a lot about this, and we can provide some links in the show notes for examples. But it's one of the reasons why I have argued, and I know you have, that you can't look at a vegetarian or vegan diet on paper and look at the nutrient values on paper and compare it to an omnivorous diet because of this key issue of bioavailability.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So there's one more thing that I want to cover, and you have educated me on this over the years, and I'm grateful for that, is the very important difference between precursor forms of nutrients and active forms of nutrients, because that's another mistake that people might make. You pick up a food label and you look at it and it says it's got X amount of vitamin A in it. Does that mean we're meeting our needs for active vitamin A?
Yeah, so this is a huge problem. And if you look at, so in plant foods, you're getting carotenoids, and these carotenoids are, a portion of them are called provitamin A carotenoids, which means that they can be converted into retinol, which is the form of vitamin A that we physiologically need in our bodies. And the problem is, even only on the basis of genetics, if we took a room with 100 people in it, of white European ancestry. This varies depending on which group you look at. But if we took white European ancestry people and we just put 100 of them in the room, we could divide like the left half of the room. We could say, okay, you're the good converters. You're good at converting carotenoids into retinol. The other half, everyone in that half on the right would be at least twice as bad, meaning their conversion would be at least as bad as only half or lower of what the people on the left would be. But you could split that group in half, and the quarter on the far right, they're 4 times worse than the good converters. So we have a huge population that on a genetic basis alone cannot do anything about the fact that they are not good at getting vitamin A from plant foods. But then you look at the other things that can impact that conversion, and you're looking at things like thyroid disorders, like other nutrient deficiencies, for example, protein deficiency, zinc deficiency, vitamin E deficiency, conditions like oxidative stress, which we associate with the general wear and tear of aging, but also many disease states. Most chronic diseases involve oxidative stress. GI problems like parasites, for example, or other absorption problems. But even what type of fat you eat. Like if you eat those foods with corn oil or any other highly polyunsaturated fat, more common now would be soybean oil or canola oil, you're getting significant lower vitamin A yield than you would get if you were eating them with more traditional fats like butter or olive oil. So there are so many factors that the genetics you cannot control. Many of those other factors you can, like you can control what type of fat you eat, but you may have hormonal disorders or GI disorders and not even know about it, right? So it's almost impossible to know for sure which camp you fall into. And in my opinion, really everyone as a basic insurance policy should try to meet their basic needs for vitamin A from retinol. And to me, that means eat liver once a week if you can stomach it. Alternatively, take cod liver oil as a daily supplement. Make sure you have some eggs in your diet, maybe dairy products if those work for you. And then you can pile on the colorful vegetables, but you don't want to be at the mercy only of the colorful vegetables.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned this, but I want to highlight it. Is this concept of nutrient synergy, where the conversion pathways from these inactive or less active forms of nutrients to the most active form require other nutrients for that enzymatic conversion to occur, right? So if you have any deficiency of those nutrients, and I know, vitamin K is a good example of this, and then alpha linolenic acid, which is converted eventually into EPA and DHA. Some studies show that less than one half of 1% of ALA gets converted into DHA. So when you see vegetarians or vegans claiming that they don't need any DHA because they can just consume flax oil, I remember doing a calculation of the amount of flax oil that they would need to consume in order to get the DHA. And that was assuming no deficiencies of nutrients that are required for all of those conversions and not taking into account the amount of omega-6 in their diet, right?
Yeah, and genetic variations in those enzymes as well. Vitamin B6 is another one. So in plant foods, you get pyridoxine, and the form that we require is pyridoxal. And if you eat plant foods, I mean, not only is the bioavailability poor because the pyridoxine is often bound up with other things in the plant food, and your ability to harvest it is actually dependent on your gut microflora. But once you get that pyridoxine in your liver, has to turn it into pyridoxal with an enzyme that requires vitamin B2, riboflavin. So you have this you're assuming that you absorb it in the first place, which is a big question mark. But then your liver's got to be healthy. You have to have enough vitamin B2. And there are also genetic variations in that enzyme as well. They're not studied well like they are for vitamin A, not even as well as essential fatty acids. But we do know that the genetic variations exist. So that's just one other example there.
So I think we've pretty well established now what some of the challenges are.
Why you should care.
For the 4 people that are still listening to this podcast and haven't just given up, let's talk a little bit about supplementation and why just taking, at least this is my opinion, I'll be curious if you agree. I have a feeling I know in part what your answer is. Why not just take a multivitamin and just call it a day? Because it's so complicated. There's so many things to consider. And, why not just head down to Costco and get a multi and get on with your life?
Well, I'm not necessarily against the basic principle of a multivitamin. I mean, it does make sense from the perspective of try to cover all your bases. But the multivitamin kind of has all the problems that we were talking about from the beginning of why the nutrient-dense diet isn't a guarantee of anything. Everything that we said basically applies to that multivitamin in terms of, do you know what your needs are? Do we know for sure what the optimal amount is and things like that? But you actually introduce other problems, which is, for example, there are many other things in foods that are critically important that cannot be in a multivitamin. Like 98% of Americans don't get the RDA for potassium. No one gets any meaningful amount of potassium from a multivitamin because you can't fit it in there.
Right.
There are nutrients that we need in amounts that cannot be put into multivitamins. There's also laws restricting potassium supplements because it can be dangerous for certain populations.
Yeah, and then 99 milligrams is what they usually contain, and the average ancestral diet, I think, has 10,500 or something.
Yeah, I've seen estimates as high as 12 grams for ancestral diets, and the RDA is 4.7 grams.
Right.
98% of people are not getting the RDA. So, I mean, potassium is a great example of why sometimes it's not even good to get it from supplements. Like the reason that the FDA regulates the potassium concentration in a supplement is that in people who have any impairment in their ability to excrete potassium in the kidneys, they can get serious and potentially fatal hyperkalemia from taking high-dose potassium supplements, even at doses that yield the RDA. And then you ask, well, what impairs the kidney's excretion of potassium? Insulin resistance, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs.
Jeez, those aren't common at all.
Yeah, things that are very common.
Yeah, and I want to mention calcium here too, because so many people are taking calcium supplements, and it's so important to get this word out. I explained this in detail in my talk, and you could just see everybody's jaw dropping in the room because it was, there were a lot of people that were middle-aged or even elderly in the room. And I would have guessed, I asked them to raise their hands and 75% were taking calcium supplements. So calcium supplements have a very different impact on our physiology than dietary calcium. And this has been well established in studies that dietary calcium reduces the risk of heart disease, reduces the risk of kidney stones. It's been associated with lower calcium scores, of course, which reduces the risk of heart attack. But calcium supplements not only don't have that benefit, they actually have the opposite effect. There are so many studies that show that people who are taking, over 1,000 milligrams of calcium have 140% of the higher risk of heart disease, higher risk of kidney stones, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important not to make the assumption that the nutrients that you get from supplements are going to have the same impact as those that you get from food.
Yeah, I think part of that is a result of the dose, because we have a lot of people who are like drinking 3 glasses of milk a day and are already consuming enough calcium. And then because they're in a certain population, like they're elderly, for example, they're
Yeah.
being told that they need more calcium and they're adding a gram on top of that and they're just really overdoing the dose. Part of it is also the form. So a lot of calcium carbonate is the most common calcium supplement because it is the cheapest one.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in the alternative health, like particularly in the supplement oriented people, understand that the bioavailability of calcium carbonate is not that great if you have low stomach acid. But the real thing that most people, I think, don't understand is that the carbonate in it has an alkalinizing effect. And we're seeing an increase in people with calcium alkali syndrome, which is a very severe problem of hypercalcemia and alkalosis that puts people into emergency care. And it's because of the combination of the high dose calcium supplementation along with alkalinizing agents. So just taking calcium carbonate increases that risk a lot. But then a lot of these other people are taking like Tums and other antacids and other stuff that are aggravating that. And I think the increased risk of heart disease is probably reflecting a lot of those things. But then there's also just the fact that when you're taking a calcium supplement, you're getting the dose all at once because you're absorbing it a lot faster. So you're a lot more likely to have transient hypercalcemia.
Yeah.
And I think, for most people, it's like you do everything that you can to get it from food first. But if there's something really barring that, then I do think there are cases where a supplement makes sense, but you want to choose the right form. And you probably want to take that at the end of your meal rather than the beginning or on an empty stomach to try to mitigate to the extent you can that transient hypercalcemia effect.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, I'm not advocating against supplements. I use them extensively in my practice, but I think, number one, you need to kind of have a strategy for supplementation. I break it into 2 different categories, therapeutic and maintenance. So therapeutic is to achieve a specific goal, take supplements for a specific amount of time to achieve a specific goal. And then maintenance is augmenting nutrients that we, for whatever reason, can't meet our need through diet alone. But I am concerned about some of the supplementation practices that I see out there. And another example above and beyond calcium and potassium that we've just been talking about is antioxidant supplementation. So, when the research started to show that antioxidants that are found in things like red wine and brightly colored vegetables were beneficial, then of course the supplement companies, all of a sudden started to get excited about antioxidant supplements. But when you look at the research on many antioxidant supplements, it found that they don't have the same effect as antioxidants in food. And in fact, they actually can increase the risk of cancer and heart disease in some cases. And that's because antioxidants are really more like pro-oxidants. They have a hormetic effect. They upregulate our body's natural or endogenous detoxification response. That's how they exert their benefit. But if you use too high a dose of something that is a pro-oxidant, it doesn't have an antioxidant effect anymore. It has a pro-oxidative effect, right? So there are just a lot of concerns or things to consider when you're taking supplements. And it's not to say that they don't have a value or play a role, and I know that you agree with that, but just that they're not harmless either.
No, and antioxidant supplements generally are not even targeting the antioxidant system in the right way. I mean, one of the centerpieces of the antioxidant system, for example, is glutathione. And the factors that are impacting your glutathione synthesis are things that are as simple as your protein intake, for example. So it's not, and protein is a great example of, you're not going to get that from a multivitamin. So there's a lot of ways that you just can't get around the need to eat well.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the nutrient cheat sheet. I was so excited when you came. I was probably one of the first people that bought this when you put it out, because this is my work. I do this every day. I probably know a little bit more about it than most people, and yet I still found it to be invaluable to have it all in one place. Because previously I was like, I got it in this file over here, or this database, or whatever, and it's. I have a lot of it in my head, but just to have one single resource to look at and say, these are the nutrients that we need to be thinking about for myself, and then of course all of my patients. And these are the food sources of these nutrients. And these are the considerations or things that you have to think about in terms of, like these particular nutrients, things that interfere with their absorption or conditions that require more of that particular nutrient. Here's what we know about how to test for this nutrient, using modern laboratory testing, both conventional and maybe less conventional. And, just to have that all in one place and written in such a way that both a clinician, experienced clinician, and a layperson can understand was super, super valuable. And I just keep it open in my PDF program. It just sits there with the tab because I refer to it so much. So I just wanted to say thanks. I can only imagine how much work that was to put that all together.
Yeah, it was incredible. And to be honest, I unfortunately spent my whole Christmas break when I visited my family for Christmas. I was expecting to be done with it, and I wasn't.
I'm saying it's hard for me to let go of projects like that if they're not finished. I'm like a dog with a bone. I think you're a bit like that too, from what I've gathered.
Yeah. So having it all in one place is the key thing. I mean, but the funny thing is, just in the backstory, I had a colleague who suggested that I produce something like this because he says, I'm going through your podcast, I'm trying to find this information, and so on work. And my first instinct was to have someone on my team start pulling the recommendations that I'd already put out in my podcast into a spreadsheet so I can start working on this. And she's like, I can't find this in this episode. And I'm like, I'll find it. And I'm like, wait, I can't find it either. And then I'm like, I realized for myself that I need something like this. And in fact, I'm probably one of the biggest users of my cheat sheet because, it's the easiest way to find what I concluded, right? Because I have a good memory, but none of us have all of the details always in our minds.
I refer to my own ADAPT training in that way sometimes too.
Yeah. So this basically breaks down how should you go about starting to analyze your nutrition depending on the resources that you have available. So there's kind of 3 ways. The comprehensive approach is when financial resources or insurance coverage or whatever for the lab testing would not be limiting for you. Mm-hmm. And in that case, you would do a comprehensive lab and urine screening. You would do a comprehensive dietary and lifestyle analysis. You would do a comprehensive screening of your signs and symptoms. Then there's 2 other approaches, which I think most people would fall into one or the other. Yeah. So the person who's like maybe the high power executive with a huge income and no time falls into the category of they need to save time. And for them, I would say, you cough up all the money for the comprehensive testing, but you don't do dietary analysis until something drives you to do it. So let's say you do the testing, you go through the signs and symptoms, and if everything points to you in the same direction, then you just follow that direction. But if it comes at a point where, trying to decide between 2 critical action items really requires you to do a dietary analysis, that's when you do it. And then for most people, I think they fall into the category where they do have enough time to do diet and lifestyle analysis and to do sign and symptom analysis, providing that they set their priorities, but they should be saving their money for when the testing is really going to make a difference. And one example I like to use that I think really illustrates where testing would wind up being really important is, let's say you had someone, imagine you have a woman who has the genetics for hemochromatosis and doesn't know it. And she, because of the amount of menstrual fluid that she loses, is lifelong predisposed to anemia. The signs and symptoms that you would get from iron overload and anemia, many of them overlap. Like fatigue, for example, could be in either of those cases. And there are some differences in them, but a lot of the major ones overlap. You could have this person who, for a huge portion of their life, knows instinctively that when they eat more red meat, they feel better. And so their reaction to what they perceive as the signs and symptoms of anemia is to eat more red meat and get their iron levels up. But then that person has a sudden change in their menstrual flow. Maybe they became menopausal, maybe they developed amenorrhea, whatever it is. Suddenly, their hemochromatosis genes are much more relevant than their menstruation to their iron status, and they are now predisposed to iron overload. Well, if that person doesn't do the testing and just goes on signs and symptoms, they're going to say to themselves, whenever I feel like this, I need to eat more red meat. And then they're just going to feel worse. And they're going to say, I must not be eating enough red meat. And they just double and triple down on it. That's one of many examples where you would have to do the right testing, because it makes the difference between two opposite actions where, depending on whether you're right or wrong, the action could either be the solution or make the problem dramatically worse. And in a case like that, you really need, and I'm sure you can think of a dozen other examples where you've used testing, but whenever it makes a difference in your action, then having that knowledge is more important than whatever the monetary cost of the test is. And that's when you definitely do the testing.
Absolutely, and the advice on testing is very thorough, and it's exactly the same kind of testing we do in our practice, and can be helpful. There are also some nutrients, Chris, that it's not very easy to test using our current laboratory assessments, like calcium. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, so calcium, it's tricky because when you look at calcium, phosphorus, and vitamin D, they're so intimately intertwined that it becomes very hard to distinguish between particularly vitamin D deficiency and calcium deficiency. So the main reason that now vitamin D, yes, it does hundreds of other things, but the main thing that impacts the amount of vitamin D that's circulating in your blood is your need to maintain normal levels of calcium. And it's critical to maintain normal levels of calcium in your blood, because you can develop serious neuromuscular conditions. You could develop tremors, you could develop seizures if you don't maintain normal levels of calcium. So your body, let's say you're calcium deficient, your body will use up more vitamin D in order to bring the calcium level back up to normal. If you measure the vitamin D levels and the calcium levels in the blood, you see the difference in the vitamin D. You don't see the difference in the calcium, because your body sucked up all the vitamin D in order to make the calcium levels normal. So how do you know whether you're dealing with a vitamin D deficiency or a calcium deficiency? Well, one of the things that I recommend is some additional testing. If you look at calcitriol, or the 125 form of vitamin D, the higher that is, the greater the probability that the problem is calcium rather than vitamin D. But you really can't get away from a proper diet and lifestyle analysis in this case. So if someone has the signs and symptoms and blood tests that look like they could be either, you have to look at things like, does this person get outside sunshine? Are they using tanning booths? Are they supplementing with vitamin D? Are they eating fish? Are they taking cod liver oil? If they're not doing any of those things, then they probably are vitamin D deficient. But if that person is doing one or more of those things, let's say they're eating fatty fish, they're always going outdoors at noontime, they go out for a walk, and they have enough clothing off that they're getting significant sun exposure, it becomes less likely that the person is vitamin D deficient. And if the person is not consuming any dairy products, not consuming any bones, not consuming many green vegetables, it becomes highly probable that they're calcium deficient. So that's an excellent example where you really need to look at the big picture and take all the evidence into account.
Yeah, and that can be challenging even for people who do this, who are professionals and who do this. I mean, Chris knows that I've sent him several case studies over the past year that are not easy to figure out at first glance. So it can get complicated, but with the cheat sheet makes it vastly simpler and easier to figure out. It's got a great index of signs and symptoms. So, you can just, if you want to kind of narrow your efforts and get started more quickly, you can just look at your symptoms and you'll start to see some patterns emerge typically when you do that. If, you look at your 8 symptoms and all 8 of them mention the deficiency of one particular nutrient or two, then obviously you're gonna focus your attention there. So that's very helpful to have that cross-reference.
Even that index was so difficult to make.
Oh yeah.
I had my assistant work on it for a week, and then I spent like a week editing it. And
I don't doubt it. Indexes are incredibly time consuming because you have to cross-reference all that content. But for that reason, they're also incredibly valuable because they allow you to visualize the information in a way that's a lot more practical, for people who are suffering from those. So, this is, I would say, definitely one of the top 5 purchases in terms of improving my own health and also, my work as a clinician. I think everybody should basically own a copy of this, to be perfectly frank. And where can they get it, Chris?
They can get it at chrismasterjohnphd.com/Chris Kresser. That will go to the page that will welcome you and tell you what I'm about to tell you now, which is how to get the discount. So from now through midnight Eastern time on March 26th, if you apply the discount code Chris Kresser into the box for it after you add it to your cart, you hit apply, you will watch the price fall from $30 to $25. And as long as you purchase it in that time period, Chris Kresser will get you that discount.
Wow, cool. Thanks, Chris. I didn't know about that, but I think my listeners will really appreciate that. And it's a no-brainer, folks. I mean, I hope you've gotten the memo in terms of how many issues there are when it comes to meeting nutrient needs. And it's not as simple as just eating a nutrient-dense diet. And I can tell you, over the past couple of years, I've been doing this work now with patients for almost a decade. And the more I do it, the more I come back to the basics. And, it's just become even more clear to me that it's pointless to focus on some of the more complex interventions and worry about the details when the basics are not dialed in yet. And, earlier on, I thought, okay, dialing in the basics means eating a healthy diet, getting enough sleep, making sure you're moving. And that is true. Those are all super important. But dialing in the diet and nutrient needs turns out to be a lot more complex than any of us would like it to be. That's the truth. I mean, I think we'd all prefer that we don't have to do this, but preferring something to be true and it actually being true is a different thing altogether. And the reality is this is the world we live in, and these are the challenges we're facing. And since I've started to use this myself and in my practice, I've seen a number of recalcitrant issues that were very difficult to figure out, even with advanced lab testing, just resolve on their own from meeting nutritional needs. And that makes sense, right? I mean, these are the nutrients that fuel all of the processes in our body. And if we're not getting enough of them, it can lead to all kinds of problems that can be really hard to figure out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Well, thank you again. Thanks for coming for your 4th appearance on Revolution Health Radio, and I look forward to the 5th.
Always a pleasure.
All right. Take care.
You too.
That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/Chris Kresser or facebook.com/Chris Kresser LAC. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.